Hi, my name is Tom Kissinger, and this is the history of income inequality and American experience. So, a little background on income inequality. Income inequality is a universal human struggle ingrained in our cultures. It's part of our fundamental culture. It exists in stories and tales that we've told throughout history. Very few societies have ever attempted to end extreme wealth. None have been successful. Um, and some actually are dedicated to the purpose of increasing extreme wealth concentration. Now, history shows that extreme income inequality has devastating effects for humanity. Specifically, most wars throughout history have been caused by poverty and lack of resources at a fundamental level. Um, and in modern times, while income inequality in developed countries is dwindling, in the United States it's actually increasing, which could potentially have very devastating effects for not just our economy, but the global economy. And unless there is reform, income inequality will continue to weave itself deeper into our society, making it more difficult to end. So, this is a quote from the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self evident that all men are created equal. So what does that mean? Does the Declaration state that every person is entitled to fundamental rights, or only those whom the state deems worthy? And do those fundamental human rights that are guaranteed in our Constitution, do those rights apply to economic issues? So the founding of income inequality in America really began right after America defeated England in the Revolutionary War at the Second Continental Congress. The Founding Fathers gathered in Philadelphia during the Second Continental Congress to discuss and implement rules that would protect them and the people from future tyrannical rule, such as they had faced under King George III. It was decided that the federal government would reign supreme and individual states would regulate anything that was not set in the Constitution. During this time, the Three-Fifths Compromise confirmed the Founding Fathers' view of economic racism by encoding a system of counting African slaves as only three-fifths of a person directly into our Constitution. This was a compromise that had to exist in order to entice the southern states who had an economic need for slavery to join the Union. Uh, During the 18th century, the rights of the nation's constitution only applied to property owners who were white males, and this established the idea of inequality from the nation's inception. Through war, through protest, through legislation, eventually those rights were extended to people of color, women, the poor, and eventually even the young when the voting age was lowered from 21 to 18 during the Vietnam War. Although they were granted permission to live the theoretical American dream, nowhere were there any protections against economic uh, inequality or lack of economic opportunities. So, through the 19th century, it's very difficult to quantify income inequality prior to 1960. There's just not a lot of data. But there is actually evidence in the 1860s that wage inequality was increasing before the Civil War. That was determined by comparing the wages of government clerks and manual laborers at military forts throughout the country. And this showed that clerks, who were considered skilled labor because of their education and ability to read and write, were actually being paid at a much higher rate than manual laborers, and the rate of increase in wages was higher for skilled laborers than it was for manual laborers. So this shows capitalism kind of in increasing inequality through no fault of its own. It's just part of the system. It's part of how it's designed. And it also highlights the correlation between education and income inequality. Um, Continued to rise through the 19th century and early 20th century as America really got into the Industrial Revolution, which introduced a lot of new technology. And basically, the cycle has always been as new technology is introduced, those who can use that technology are paid higher wages than those who can't. and that cycle has continued until today, with little to no abatement. However, it's also important to remember that other inequalities in education, healthcare, and voting rights are contributing factors to future success in the economy. So if you have a bad school growing up and you don't have proper healthcare and you're not able to change those things through voting, it's very difficult to get out of a cycle of income inequality. And then we hit World War II, where for really the first time in American history, this trend completely reversed itself. And that was due to policies that were enacted because of World War II and the Great Depression. Specifically, high tax rates on the wealthy, and IRS tax data and Social Security data show a large drop in relative income of top earners around World War II. Now, during that time, the United States was also able to invest in public education, infrastructure, and welfare programs, creating one of the most skilled workforces in history. However, like all things economic, it's a cycle, and that cycle began to end in the late 1970s, specifically with the introduction of Reagan as president. That was really the beginning of inequality as a social problem. Prior to 1979, there was insufficient empirical data to support the claim that inequality was a social problem. But since that time, since 1979, income inequality has been increasing exponentially, with a particularly high surge in the extremely wealthy, so billionaires. The recent shift in income inequality is a direct result of the political process. The switch from the New Deal era of liberal progressivism to the conservative era brought tax and labor policies that disproportionately benefited the rich. And if you have money, you're making more money than anybody could possibly make working a job. American policy continues to be written in a way that segregates society into lower, middle, and upper classes, and you can see that in the fact that neighborhoods and schools are actually resegregating. According to an article by US News, 53% of black students attend predominantly black schools today, compared to only 25% in 1972. So we're going back to pre-Brown versus Board of Education levels of inequality. So what does the future look like? Well, the American system of economic injustice is now spreading to other nations through trade agreements like the North American Free Trade Agreement and the current Trans-Pacific Partnership. Corporations have been granted many of the rights of people as if they were people. And if you have a corporation that thinks it's a person and has a legal right to claim rights, that's a pretty dangerous situation, especially for human rights. By claiming that restrictions in their trade agreements will damage the U.S. economy, corporations and political parties will continue to raise prices and outsource jobs. And in conclusion, in 1976, the Founding Fathers had the best of intentions when they created the documents that would be at the heart of the United States. However, over time, government corruption, human nature, discrimination, they've all played a role in causing the majority of American citizens to fight a never-ending vicious cycle of income inequality, where they're just struggling to survive. And if you read books, if you read diaries of people throughout the American history of the average person, it has been a struggle. And that is a struggle that continues to today. And the cyclical pattern will continue with the implementation of new trade agreements that allow businesses and corporations to economically enslave the majority of the American population. So, thanks for listening, and my name is Tom Kissinger, and again, this has been the history of income inequality and American experience.